Vítáme vás u dalšího dílu podcastu Insider, který moderuji já, Michal Půr, a můj kolega Tomáš Jirsa.
Dobrý den.
Na začátek pár obligátních vzkazů.
Partnerem tohoto podcastu je American Academy, americká mezinárodní základní střední škola v Praze, projektová výuka, zahraniční učitele, výuka STEM a studium pouze v angličtině, advokátní kancelář Rowan Legal. Každou středu poslouchejte, a někdy i čtvrtek, a někdy i úterý poslouchejte náš formát Insider Briefing, kde se věnujeme různým aktuálním věcem. A dneska máme speciální díl, kdy jsme tady v Kumbálku, v improvizovaném studiu na Shifts Prague 23, což je taková velká konference, která nás konfrontuje s děním ve světě. A my jsme si tady trošku vynutili jednoho z nejzajímavějších speakerů a hostů. Kdo to je?
Je to Sir Alexe Youngera, nejdéle sloužící šéf britské rozvědky SIS, známé též jako MI6 od roku 2014 do roku 2020. Byl důstojníkem MI6 na Blízkém východě. So, Sir Alex, it's great to have you here.
Welcome to Prague.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. My question: we had a prep call for the conference for your speech, keynote speech, and it was I believe it was Thursday before the hell broke loose in the Middle East, and it all seemed, situation is pretty stable. Ukraine is kind of tiring people. It's 2 years ongoing. Everybody's used to it in Europe, and it all started shifting towards business as usual. And then this happened. So how big of a shift, if the conference is called Shift, does it represent?
This is the depressing thing, Thomas. It's not a shift at all. So I'll talk today about things that are and the way in which I think we're at a turning point in some really important phases represented by the rise of China and the nihilism of Vladimir Putin. But this has been going on for a very long time. And the only surprising thing really is how we've been able to ignore this situation and convince ourselves that it had gone away. And that was self-evidently not the case. Now, I'm as guilty as everybody else. When we were talking, I probably was feeling quite optimistic at the time, given the process of normalization, the Abraham Accords taking place, particularly between Saudi Arabia and Israel. It felt in some ways like we were at the dawn of something changing. But of course, we've been violently and horribly reminded that that is not the case. This is not something that will solve itself.
Yeah, I see in Czech public discourse two general views. One is we had 30 years in our case after the fall of communism of peace, growth, stability, international order, and it's over. It's over, and the era of uncertainty, of wars around us and security threats rising. The other view is it's business as usual. Okay, there's war in Ukraine, some shake-up in the Middle East, but overall we'll just go through it, and it's not a big shift. So where you stand in between those two quite opposing views?
It's I'm afraid to say, a mixture. So I have a background as an intelligence officer, a spy, and that has had two effects on me. One, an understanding that this idea, the thing you were just talking about, Thomas, that history had ended, okay?
Yeah.
That democracy had triumphed, that we were in some postmodern world. I've always known that wasn't true, okay? In my world, Vladimir Putin or our other adversaries, they didn't get the memo about democracy triumphing. And we were in a pretty well constant struggle, really, since the beginning of this century. So this idea that a postmodern world where you could separate geopolitics and economics never felt very real to me. And therefore, the fact that history hasn't ended, we're back in a time of ideological contest, this feels to me like this is the normal. And it was the past that was the recent 30-year past that was the abnormal. But secondly, I am a human intelligence officer, and that actually imbues you with great faith about the power of individuals to change things. The whole business model is based on the small group of people making a very big difference.
Yeah.
And I see all around me that happening. And the 30 years of freedom you have enjoyed here is arguably that happening. And it is impossible not to be fundamentally optimistic when you look at the intrinsic strengths that have driven this amazing period. So I don't think there's any scope for complacency, and we need to understand the challenges that exist around us. But my advice always is actually we need to remember the things that keep us make us strong, and we need to double down on them. And I know what they are, and we need to use them.
So you've spent many years in the Middle East. There are some debates about the situation that if the situation will evolve to the regional war, or will it be just the case of Gaza Strip? How bad is the situation? Because my wife often asks me how bad it is, and I am not able to give her an honest answer, because it feels like you are on the brink of World War III, as I would say. You can't tell her.
I think that it could be bad, but I think that people are working quite hard to ensure that it isn't, more perhaps than I would have expected. So, why did Hamas do this? Well, it's a good question. It's an act of nihilism, really. But of course, terrorism isn't the action in the end, appalling though this action is, it's the reaction. They're attempting to stimulate a reaction from Israel and the Israeli government that essentially throws the country and then the region into turmoil, thus improving their position. I think this is the warped logic that is in their head. So this question of escalation is fundamentally something Hamas is seeking to achieve. And I think both the Israeli government and the American government understand that. So the Israeli government are enraged, the Israeli people are enraged. This is an act of terrorism, pure and simple, and they will, and I believe that they have the right to strike very hard against Hamas to destroy the infrastructure that allowed this to happen. I hope, though, and I believe, in fact, they will understand that they can't just respond to the script that Hamas is writing for them, and that this needs to be done in a way that doesn't make the situation even worse. Because to answer your question, if this leads to a broader uprising in Israel involving the groups in the West Bank and then pulling in Hezbollah, you are in a very dangerous situation at the moment. If that happens, looked at from an Israeli perspective, you've got three issues. You've got Hamas, you've got the West Bank, and you've got Hezbollah, all of which basically have Iranian support. And Iran starts to be the consistent problem that you face. And I think the risks of escalation in those terms become higher. Also, of course, there is the possibility that something emerges that demonstrates that Iran actively directed the attack from Gaza, which I think would also be extremely incendiary. At the moment, it doesn't look like that intelligence exists, and I hope it doesn't exist. And in practice, I believe that Iran are responsible. They trained and financed Hamas. I don't actually believe that they direct their operational activity, but we will see.
I started to become nervous when the United States decided to move the second ship, the carrier, to the air, which signifies some, that it is maybe a level up in seriousness and in geopolitical scale. So how you kind of said it, you don't think there is. It's a very coordinated and synchronized attack, but it's hard to resist this kind of idea that, with all the traditional adversaries and allies and Vladimir Putin struggling in Ukraine and the situation being kind of deadlocked, China trying to, outmaneuver the US globally, and then suddenly you have this kind of big escalation that draws a lot of power from American military and Europe as well. And you really have to focus and kind of drain your resources. Is there any idea? Maybe it's purely on ideological level, but do you see this kind of possible synchronization of these, traditional adversaries of the West?
No, I don't think that's what's happening. One of the insights you get from 30 years intelligence is it's normally not a conspiracy. It's normally a cock-up. So
I'm not sure if this is like calming.
Absolutely. So, I mean, actually, bottom line is I think that Hamas never expected to be this successful. Wow. So a set of essentially accidents meant that Israel was not well prepared for what happened. I think everybody missed the change in the quality of the capabilities that Hamas bring to this. Hamas is actually acting out of weakness, essentially. This wasn't a sign of strength. They're feeling marginalized, particularly in the context of the Abraham Accords. I think they achieved much, it was also catastrophically overachieved in their operational objectives and set us on the cycle which we're now on. I think you should be reassured by the presence of the two carrier groups in the Eastern Mediterranean. The reality is carrier groups are not useful when you're hunting down terrorists. But when you're looking at a quasi-state structure like Hezbollah, they're an excellent way of deterring what might happen next. And it's Hezbollah, I emphasize this, it's Hezbollah's entry into this that is going to worry your wife, and quite rightly.
Yeah. Okay.
So that is a parastatal unit that you can deter through the threat of the use of air power. As to how all this fits together, I don't think there's any sort of idea of coordination. But to be absolutely sure, to your point, Thomas, it will be exploited to the full.
Yeah.
And in this axis of resistance, as it's now called, which is North Korea, Iran and Russia, you have those three countries now bound together in their opposition to everything the West stands for. It's very noticeable. Russia's taken a surprisingly hard line. Normally they try to play both ends, but they've been really clear this is Israel's fault, and they're supporting what has happened. And that is a sign that they see an opportunity for sure.
How do you interpret what people perceived as a very ambivalent approach of Israel to the situation in Ukraine, which was probably understandable with the explanation in the region and situation in Syria and all of this, and need to have some communication channel with the Russians.
Yeah.
So in that context, now this very, I would say, firm and very clear message that the Russians are sending, how...
Well, in a sense, I would hope that reveals to the Israeli government the need to take a position. So they, I've been very clear with them. It is a mistake.
Yeah.
To try to you can have a pragmatic relationship with Russia for sure. Everybody needs to do that. Yeah. But you need to understand what you've got here. Now, the consistent argument that Israel employs in these circumstances, which is a function of its terrible history, is that it has a particular duty to manage its security environment. The reality is, because Russia has a dominant position in Syria, they have to find ways of at least coordinating. There's a very significant Russian diaspora, and. But yeah, I think this is an example that ultimately Vladimir Putin's regime is not a regime that you can even find really a tenuous set of reasons to work with.
Yeah.
Head of Shin Bet intelligence service said yesterday that it was his failure, his personal failure that this happened. Do you see that as an honest answer?
Well, it's a brave answer, and it's a dignified answer. In fact, I think it's more complicated than that. And by the way, the whole sort of concept of talking about intelligence failures is something that makes me very uncomfortable. I am a former practitioner. Yeah. And whilst I believe we should all acknowledge failures when they occur, the one thing that we all have sitting in our nice seats in this warm studio that you do not have at the time is hindsight. And we need to be very careful using the judgment of hindsight. It is not available. I was in charge of our counterterrorism efforts for a long time, and you do not have hindsight. You have to go in a very uncertain and difficult and dusty and muddy environment. And that is where these people are working all the time. Now, clearly, at the sort of technical level, there do appear to have been a set of issues, and I imagine that is what he is alluding to. But really, if you look at this step back, it's not just an intelligence failure, it's an imagination failure. You know, the reality is that 70% of the IDF was in the West Bank when this happened. There was, I think, a sense, a conflation of what the Israeli government wanted to be true and what was true. They wanted Gaza to be on the back burner so that they could focus on a set of more political agendas that they had in the West Bank. And of course, the chaos, the squabbling in the Israeli government cannot have helped when it came to allowing people to focus on their job. So I think it's more complicated than a technical failure on the part of the intelligence services.
When we look at the broader picture, do you think the real shift is that in perception of people like Vladimir Putin or terrorists from Hamas or anybody opposed to what we enjoy here in the West, all these things, either Ukraine and all this testing of our willingness to invest in our defense, came at a moment where they sensed pretty rationally that Europe, with maybe its very nice and very ambitious plans for Green Deal and the future that will be absolutely different, while being extremely dependent on Russian supply. Maybe Israel being torn between, not civil unrest, but the very, very weakening process of protests against the government and internal disputes. So is this the time where the enemies kind of sense the very fragile, very open wounds that they can exploit?
Yeah, I think that there's something in that. I know that Vladimir Putin said that the US was in the same state a couple of years ago when Donald Trump was in charge, that the Soviet Union had been in before it fell apart. He had convinced himself that the dysfunction he saw in Washington was a sign of an underlying weakness. Now, that is obviously completely wrong, but that is the way that his mind works. Xi Jinping, for his part, he's more sincere than Vladimir Putin. He genuinely believes that socialism with Chinese characteristics is emerging as a superior alternative to what we talk of as liberal democracy. That is not actually synthetic. He thinks that. Now, some things have emerged to prove those assumptions wrong, and specifically in the context of the Ukraine war. So my colleagues and I, we were very clever. We predicted exactly when Putin was going to do this and told the world, clever us. But what we didn't predict, or certainly what I did not predict, was the quality of the European response. Of course, initially, Zelensky's astonishing discovery of his leadership talents and his ability to pull Ukraine together. But also, if you remember that speech that Olaf Scholz made on the first Saturday, where he talked about Zeitenwende and all of these things. And the reality is Europe, the European Union, the transatlantic alliance has proved to be far more coherent and far tougher than I expected, and crucially, than Vladimir Putin expected. So the terrible irony of what you've just said is if they had actually understood how strong we were, and if we had understood how strong we were, this wouldn't have happened. So you're completely correct. In a set of, frankly, appeasement measures for Georgia and in Crimea and in Syria, we sent a strong signal to Russia that we weren't prepared to stand up for the things that we believed in.
Yeah.
And it turned out, ironically, that we were.
Yeah.
Do you believe we will be able to keep the quality in our response, to the Ukraine conflict?
Well, I'm super focused on this, and I've always worried that somehow the sort of governments and elites of Europe in particular are ahead of their people in all of this. But I don't know what you guys think, but after 2 years of this, it actually seems that there is a real resilience here, and the energy crisis has enacted a real toll on people's livelihoods. And yet, broadly speaking, support is staying strong. Now, I think we are in for a very political year next year as it emerges that there isn't a military solution to this close at hand. And given the position that some of the Republicans are taking in Washington. But I don't know about you, my expectations have been exceeded when it comes to popular willingness to support this. I come from a small village in the east of England, and every second flag on the high street is a Ukrainian flag.
Nice.
And those flags are still there.
Wow. I think we feel the same, and the Czech Republic is, I would say, very exceptional in public support. It's overwhelming. It's, I don't know, between 80 and 90%.
Yeah.
I think Czech government was the first in line to actually sit on a train and go to Kiev, and when everybody else was afraid.
Yeah.
And I think Britain played, even outside EU, a very significant role.
I think they've named a street after Boris Johnson.
Yeah. Oh, in Kiev.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah, I mean, he was a big supporter.
He was right there
up until now. But the sense that I have is there was this crucial month at the start where nobody really knew what Germany is going to do. It was very open-end question. And from that moment, we see what you're talking about, is kind of unity. But still, there are, I would say, worrying signs. One is the absolute reliance on American presence and inability. I mean, again, I would say that in the Czech Republic, we just made a decision to buy the F-35s and invest heavily in our army, as maybe Poland did. But overall, around Europe, if you look at the state of armies, of the defense structures, it's a sad outlook. and I think people, when faced with increasing costs and hard decisions, because it's either we buy the F-35s or maybe we spend on healthcare or other things, so that will create a big tension. And I think it's but from my point of view, there's really mixed signals from the European leadership with regards to this, maybe the Green Deal and its adapting to reality and support for or humanitarian aid for Palestine. And so isn't it still that you kind of don't have this one number to call somebody in Europe and get a decision? Isn't that the problem?
Yeah, I mean, it's undeniable that the situation in Washington, well, it must be the thing that preoccupies Zelensky more than anything else. And there is this extreme possibility of Donald Trump getting elected, and that is perfectly likely that he gets elected, and then following through on some of the promises he's made to stop the war on day one, which can only mean stopping it on Russian terms. And that would be a disaster for Europe because, as I think we've all agreed, stopping the war on Russian terms isn't going to make our continent less dangerous. It's going to make it more dangerous because it will vindicate what he's done. And this is, very clearly unfinished business. Now, a lot would depend on whether Donald Trump followed through. The reality is that it would embolden China, amongst other things, and that's something he apparently cares about. So who knows if the rhetoric will match. And also, the really big one is what stopping support would mean. If it means essentially withdrawing the sort of security guarantees that are intrinsic to NATO, we have got a really big problem, but I very much hope that it doesn't mean that. So let's just accept, therefore, a reality. Even if Trump doesn't get in, there's a sufficiently active debate in Washington about this for Europe to have to understand that what you said is true. Increasingly, we are going to have to take care of our own security. Now, I vehemently hope that that's never out of the context of this deep interdependence with America. But fundamentally, there's an up arrow next to Europe owning its own security. And that has got a whole set of implications, not all of them bad, by the way. I think, in a sense, Vladimir Putin has done us a favor. He's reminded us that we do need to take responsibility. And I think we're already a completely different place to we were. But the reality is we're going to have to take decisions. We're going to have to grow our defense capacity and capability. We have, for instance, just seen the miraculous enlargement of NATO. So, we have the structures to do this. But I think we're going to have to stand up, and that will be a question, of course, of political leadership, as I think you were saying, Thomas. But also, it's not like it's a difficult argument to sell. This might have been an abstract idea 2 years ago. It really isn't now.
Yeah.
So I have a feeling that regarding the Ukrainian war and the conflict on the Middle East, that it is the Europe who pays the price always. Always. It's not the United States. What we should do to be better, what we should do to make things changed. So are we lacking, is it the politicians or is it the society? What is it?
It's us. So this is the shift. There's been a shift. This idea, I think in Europe we got carried away by the idea that we had tamed the forces of history. We're in some postmodern period and we could afford to run down our militaries, increase our social spending, because the world was now a less dangerous place. Now, that was just wrong. What was actually going on is we were under a US security umbrella. Now, that's still a pretty formidable umbrella, but we're now discovering where the limits lie, and the US's ambitions are changing. So we now know that in the real world, our model is going to be contested more and more and more. And that if you take a simplistic view, as in Germany, that you can take your security from America, your gas from Russia, and your market from China. That is effectively to ignore a whole set of geopolitical risks that come with that model that you can't ignore anymore. But we're all complicit in this, in the sense of the things we demand from our governments. So I think it's going to take a while for reality to dawn. But I think, to go back to what I said at the beginning, there's also processes for remembering we have a set of things that make us really strong. So if you want to say what worries me the most, it's not our ability to build up our defense industries and our military industrial complexes. I think, we can do that. We've done it before. My view is that the real battle here is on the technology side. And there are a set of technologies growing, and the value system that dominates those will be the one that has the geopolitical power. And I think China has really worked that one out. It has a plan to dominate the key emerging technologies. America is now reacting. Where is Europe in this space? What are we actually doing to produce the next global innovations that will keep us at the front of this race? Because that is the thing that will give our kids choices.
Yeah. No, it's where I wanted to, aim this next question, because obviously there's a strong correlation, unless you are North Korea, between economic strength and strength of your business and capital markets and of course technologies and military might. I think it's undisputable that U.S. is managing those two things on the highest possible levels, having open market economy and very strong innovation drive and investment in new technologies, and while at the same time maintaining strong military might and presence all around the world. The strange combination that China has, which is authoritarian, communistic, I don't know how to describe it, like authoritarian societal management with some mixture of free market, also proves that they're able, in technology-wise, to be at the top of the development. The worry about Europe is, and we just recently had an interview with an energy expert that said, Europe is losing this kind of source of growth. Doesn't have any more friends in the world. USA being a friend and competitor as well. So where is this chance of finding this, so that the EU or Europe as a whole doesn't become some kind of a bumper area between two competing poles?
Yeah. Well, look, I think that's kind of the most important question of our time. This idea of whether China can sustain its innovative potential whilst also Xi Jinping repoliticizes China, closes down the private space even more, and reduces the scope for private initiative. It's a really open question. It's possible that may be very difficult, but I don't think we should assume that China will fail because, as you say, it's bringing huge resources and a very long-term approach. I think the innovative power of US and its distributed system is undoubted. And the issue is us in Europe. I did not vote for Brexit. I do not think Brexit is a good idea, but in this respect, I now encourage my government to be as different from Europe as it possibly can be. Mm-hmm. Because the reality is the decisions that are being taken are not going to allow us to win this race. There is an utterly laudable and understandable, given the history of Europe, idea that we must at all costs conserve the private space and privacy. Yeah. And all of the technology law is written with that in mind. And given the tyrannies that we've had on our continent, it's understandable. But in fact, I think the practice has been to treat technology as a risk before it is an opportunity. And the actual consequence of what's coming out will be to allow concentration and to suppress innovation. And that's going to lead to us having the biggest privacy problem of all, which is to be completely reliant on predominantly Chinese technology to do what we want to do. And then privacy will not exist. So we've got to get geopolitically real about this. My second point is that, industrial policy is back. Even the US is doing it with the IRA. And there's a real risk, which can only help China, that you get European industrial policy and American industrial policy in competition with each other. And to some extent, that's inevitable. Yeah. But I think in the technology space, we need to sit down and work out that is only going to help people who don't share our values.
Actually, you were one of the first individuals who raised the alarm about the Huawei thing.
Yeah.
So what was the perception of the politicians when you said them, okay, come on, guys, this is a big problem, so we can lose the entry to the network, to see everything. Did they believe you?
Well, it's really important, again, back to this hindsight point, this was kind of 2010 or whatever, it was a while ago, and it just felt different then. It was a bit later in 2010. But I think there was still a large constituency that believed that some kind of equilibrium with China was going to be possible, which would allow, really safe and almost unconditional economic relationship, which would drive prosperity. That was kind of the assumption that had existed before. And it became clear, not least because of the particular style that Xi Jinping has, that he doesn't see it like that at all. He sees quite a lot of the technology connections that exist as a threat, and he was going to make sure that China was self-sufficient in the things that really mattered. Honestly, that's probably more apparent to people in my position than it is for people who are trying to manage the whole relationship. So, that was a tense and difficult conversation. The US were putting us under a lot of pressure. But and in the end, we made the decision. I think the decision was based on concerns about security, and they are there. But my concern, if I am to be honest with you, is very different. It's that we cannot allow ourselves to become dependent for our critical national infrastructure on a value system that is different to ours. Now, there are lots of areas. I think decoupling is a ridiculous idea. But there are some areas where you really do have to understand that you have introduced a vulnerability, an intolerable vulnerability, if you're basically giving an off switch to people where you may eventually end up in some kind of adversarial relationship. And that was my position, and I think it's now become the position. But it costs a lot of money, and when we talk about this, we need to be honest that it's going to require us to change as much as the technology.
My question is, isn't there this kind of a lack of as you mentioned with China, very thought through long-term approach, a strategy, because we see we really had a lot of talks about energy dependency and security, and suddenly there's this sudden realization that Russia has this kind of blackmail potential, and it caused a lot of trouble. On the other hand, if you really go through, and we had Václav Smil, he's like the very famous, world-renowned Czech, who's very involved in talks about energy, and he basically said the whole chain of dependency concerning or around renewables, with the solar panels, everything. If you look at the minerals you need, again, all of it is, most of it is under quite significant Chinese control in Congo, in other African states. So aren't we just replacing one type of energy dependency on another one with?
Yeah, no, it's not perfect, and I think Chinese securitization and politicization of the supply chain, particularly with rare earths and transition materials, is really worrying. But if I can cite a Chinese proverb on this occasion, so the best time to plant a tree is 17 years ago. The second best time to plant a tree is now. Okay, so let's just understand we are in this situation. Let us learn the lessons. And let us stop obsessing about China. This is about us. Let's think about the things that make us strong. So I'll give you 3 things that make us strong. The quality of our democratic system, which I think has been proved again and again to be more resilient than authoritarian alternatives. Our capacity to make alliances, which is not something authoritarians enjoy. And I believe fundamentally our innovative capability. Now, we can double down on those strengths. And I can assure you that when looked at from Beijing and Moscow, those strengths are very apparent to our opponents. So this is not a perfect situation. We have to some extent swapped one dependency for another. But this is why I come back to innovation. And I come back to a thing that I talked about right at the beginning, having a certain amount of faith in our capacity as human beings to rise to the occasions and do stuff. You want my honest view? I haven't really said this before. I think we have become decadent. We had decided we could ignore reality. That isn't the case anymore.
Regarding the China, I'm pretty afraid that I believe that we see the decline of China. Definitely in economy, society, they are losing people and so on. And when there is such a situation, and the Xi Jinping is, we can see it in the problem. I'm afraid that he can make something stupid, like an invasion to Taiwan. That's a big concern. So, do you believe that something like that is possible?
No, so I agree with you. I think the position is weaker in China than we understand, and it's through a combination of a set of structural economic imbalances in the economy between investment and consumption, or young and old, or regionally, mean that there are some really significant issues. But also a combination with the politics, where Xi Jinping has concluded that he has to assert more control over every aspect of life, and that's just going to produce a headwind. So I think you see Chinese growth slowing down, and in Zhongnanhai, behind the facade, you probably see more and more political difficulty and dissonance and all that. Now, I fundamentally think there are dangers in that for us, given the nature of a centralized regime. And what you say is true. If you don't have any more ideological legitimacy, really, you don't after Tiananmen Square and zero COVID and all that. If you don't have economic legitimacy, if the growth is slowing, then nationalism is all that is left. So it is definitely the case, and you can hear it already, the idea of the great rejuvenation, the Chinese dream, moving into a much more aggressive and assertive stance, at least in the near abroad. But actually, I think in some way, in my head, and this is an unusual view, the conversation's moving on from Taiwan. It's much more about China, how Xi Jinping is going to behave within China, if he's going to change to do something about the economic problems. And whilst I think that he will take steps to demonstrate that China has risen, there are lots of other things he can do, particularly in the South China Sea, that are much, much less dangerous than a full-scale invasion of Taiwan. He knows that that is a catastrophically risky course to follow, particularly in the context of Ukraine and what has happened there. So I do not believe that it is his intent to invade. I also think that he can achieve a lot of what he wants to achieve through coercion rather than the outright use of military force. So I think it will get bumpy and it will get dangerous, but my prediction, it's not a useful prediction, is that wherever it happens, it will be somewhere that surprises us.
Okay. There's a lot of questions about Europe internally, and we talked a bit about the Green Deal. The other big topic that seems to be one of the major topics of the upcoming European elections happening in May next year is migration. I think the recent events in Israel kind of put question marks in a lot of people observing mass protests and I would say cultural differences. The leader of the ODS candidate list to the European Parliament said it was a big illusion that you can import a big population of people and not import their internal struggles and problems. So how much of this internal possible security threat is how serious it is? We saw yesterday in Brussels one of the terrorist attacks. Can we expect more? Can this outpour in more terror waves in Europe?
It's a very political question which we confronted head on during that horrible spate of violence, 2016, 2017, the Bataclan attack and all of that. Yeah. And the prospect of bad actors, terrorists exploiting migration flows, illegal or legal, to get into Europe and do bad stuff now, and crucially exploit all of the sort of political divides that mass immigration creates, a place where we have to tread extraordinarily carefully. But my message is really clear. You have security services like us. We can deal with those threats. Those threats should not define our strategic approach to this problem. It is a much, much bigger issue than that. The fundamental issue is demographics, okay? Now, the fundamental issue that Israel faces is demographics. The reason you can't ignore the Palestinians indefinitely is the birth rate is entirely different. Yeah. And that ultimately it's going to become impossible to ignore that fact. Europe is in the same position. In Niger, the replacement rate is 6. In Italy, it's 1.2.
Yeah.
What do you think is going to happen? Now, you can have the world as you want it, but can we just focus on the world as it is? It's completely unsustainable.
Yeah. So we have like 15 minutes more. So let's go to the questions from our subscribers. There's one very similar question. Michal Řehoř, what is your point of view on pro-Hamas demonstration in London and other European cities? Are these people security risk?
Sorry, which demonstration?
Are these people security risk?
Which demonstration?
The pro-Hamas.
Pro-Hamas. I think that they are...
Pro-Palestine.
Yeah. So look, I think obviously anybody protesting in favour of Hamas is in the UK committing a criminal offence and should be recognised as such. So anyone glorifying or suggesting or propagating violence that is against the law, and I believe that we should act accordingly. Anybody who glories in what has happened, frankly, I think just needs to sit down and have a good hard look at themselves, and including people who draw an equivalence between the actions of Hamas and the actions of Israel. I just profoundly disagree with them. Of course, where the issue comes, I think, is a conflation of the cause of the Palestinian people with Hamas, and that just couldn't be more wrong. Probably, the standout victim of what has happened will be the Palestine people, who will be the victim of a cycle of violence unleashed by Hamas. And people talk about conditions in Gaza and the responsibility that the Israeli government bear for that, and they do bear responsibility. But let's bear in mind, it's been run by Hamas for a very long time, and they bear themselves very significant responsibility. So, to come back to a theme of our conversation, I think people need to get real. The idea that Hamas are going to help the plight of the Palestinian people, which is something we all sympathize with deeply, is to my mind complete nonsense. I think these demonstrations will be, I hope, policed in accordance with our values. People have a right to say what they think, short of glorifying or advocating violence. But I think we should be really, really clear about that.
Do you think there will be some kind of reality check with diplomacy or Europe's stance towards regimes maybe in the Middle East other than Israel that are not, the case study is being Egypt, where you had the risk of Muslim Brotherhood, very, very radical leadership, and it was replaced by the current president, who was not the progressive liberal Democrat some people would love to see. But shouldn't we admit that it's just the better solution and, not maybe impose sanctions, maybe, is there kind of reality check that the world is more difficult and sometimes we have to settle with people that maybe are not trying to kill us rather than...
The world is more difficult, so I fully acknowledge that in the values versus interests debate, you can't just be all for one and not for the other. We need to be pragmatic in our approach, accept the world as it is. But can we also please remember that it is our values that make us strong. So this is why we pay politicians.
Yeah.
They have to be able to strike a balance between the two. And I'm really suspicious of people who, on the one side or the other, announce that this is the new way of doing stuff. We're all human beings. We've all got a moral framework. I think we can, every day in our lives, we make compromises. And every day in our lives, we stand up in a way that makes us proud. It's the same for countries.
Well, Patrick, hello, Sir Alex. How far from true is the context of world events in the media? And do they even have a chance to bring the correct context to the public, as they do not have the same tools as a secret service? I think now the case study with Israel, you see social media flooded with thousands and thousands, real-time footage, videos, pictures, information, some of them proven, fakes. How in this
mess.
Yeah, how in this mess you can orient yourself, not being a secret service with all the tools.
Good news is you do have the tools. You absolutely do. So if you look at the array of private sector intelligence capabilities that now exist, you have stuff that we would have regarded as our monopoly 7 or 8 years ago. Okay, so it is all there for the finding out. I don't accept that there's a sort of government version and a private sector version. Of course, there is a problem with excess of information. I think that AI, large language models in particular, may help with that. But the real problem is our capacity for critical thinking, and the tsunami of disinformation that we see in the social media space. And I fully acknowledge that is a problem. And by the way, it's more of a problem for democracies than autocracies. So it's an asymmetric vulnerability.
One from Jan Kuchera. Could you name one thing the UK, society or the government, mastered in such a way that other countries should take inspiration from that? Maybe kind of reacting to this coverage of Brexit and people think, oh, it's messy, and maybe, Britain is just falling off the cliff.
No, I think a thing that we've done like over hundreds of years that we are very good at is we distribute, we don't centralize. Okay, so we ran this huge empire, we've done all this stuff. We are a country that is actually 4 countries, etc. But the instinct at every turn appears to be a relatively relaxed approach to the devolution of power, and a real instinctive suspicion of over-centralization. And I think that was one of the things that allowed people who advocated Brexit to be successful. And I think there is a pretty good lesson there for everybody else. These people who are looking for maximalist, centralized, clean solutions to everything are not going to succeed. We are an extremely pragmatic country. We don't even have a constitution. And all of this is a source of the messiness that you see. And, I'm conscious in Europe that there will be people who regard our failure to execute Brexit cleanly in a positive light because it discourages other people from trying to do the same thing. But that messiness is fundamentally a function of an underlying strength. You would expect me to say that, but it nonetheless is something I believe to be true.
Another one from Jan Kuchera. Based on your experience, what would you include as a mandatory part of a high school curriculum? In other words, what should all people be taught to keep our social, economic, political system stable in the environment of increasing complexity?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and the simple answer is critical thinking. So just to go back to what we were talking about, this tsunami of information, we need to formally teach kids in schools about how to retain the capacity for objective decision making. And I fear, frankly, often we do exactly the opposite.
Yeah. One of the questions is about how all this technology advancement changes the work of a security service. My question, because I just finished, or we both finished reading Elon Musk, the biography by Walter Isaacson. So suddenly we had this guy who's running satellites into space, has his own satellite network, provides internet, obviously has power to decide whether one country can use the service to proceed with military actions or switch it off, or so how in this it's almost like a James Bond environment. So how do you deal with somebody who gains such technological advantage and power in the
they need to be more accountable. These large US platforms are larger than most medium-sized countries, and yet in law they're not even responsible for the stuff that people do with their products. And we don't want to kill the innovation goose, but the reality is it's not acceptable for them not to carry the consequences ultimately of the way in which these inventions are used. So I don't think it should be total in some ways. They need to be, we need to incentivize this type of innovation, but it is, we need to find ways to make them understand culturally and legally that they are responsible for what they do and say.
And is it some kind of a paradigm shift when there's one guy who has this kind of space capability, unrivaled by many nations? As well, he has a total control of Twitter, or it's now called X, global information environment for sharing a lot of news. He does a lot of other stuff, implanting chips in brain. So how do you deal with that as a secret agency with somebody who is suddenly?
It is a pretty extraordinary situation. We haven't talked about this much, but I think there isn't a global governance solution to this because the global governance is completely deadlocked. But it so happens that most of this is actually happening in the US.
Yeah.
And there is therefore theoretically a political route to recognizing this is a new phenomenon, and the way in which corporations and private entities are controlled needs to change. But of course, I'm not optimistic about that happening in the current environment.
Yeah, there's a very funny question from Tomáš Michal. Hi, how much different is the image of the MI6 from the one portrayed in the latest James Bond episode? So this is the latest one is the episode where James Bond dies.
Oh right, okay. It's very, very different, but it's much, much more interesting, the real version, than the fictional version.
That's a good answer.
Really? So, okay, that's a very good answer.
Yeah.
So, just maybe one last question, which I forgot. Regarding the China, there is an India also. No one talks about. Is it the possible ally of our civilization, Western civilization, to make things much difficult for the China? And is it the future opponent? I would say, the opponent.
So just to put it really simply, I mean, I think fundamentally, India is never going to want to be seen to choose a side.
Yeah.
But in practice, it will be more defined by its rivalry with China than its friendship with Russia. And I think that's positive for us.
So something positive in the end.
That's how we like to end.
That's how positive.
So thank you for the interview.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.
Great, nice to see you.
Thank you. Enjoy your stay in Prague.
I will.